Welcome to the debate. We are opening the discussion today on a topic really fundamental to modern decentralized finance, yield farming. Specifically, we're looking at the principles and the framing presented in the source material, Yield Farming for Beginners, a 2025 guide. Now, this material presents yield farming as, well, a pretty straightforward, low-barrier way to get passive income, emphasizing simplicity and accessibility. So the central question we really need to tackle is this. Is the guide's framing of yield farming genuinely simple and accessible for a complete novice? Does it offer a truly safe entry point? Or does the promotional language kind of dangerously minimize the necessary technical know-how and, importantly, the inherent financial risk you need to accept to get those really appealing returns? I'll be arguing that the guide actually provides a realistic, safe starting point, clearly defines the risks, and successfully mitigates them for any beginner who sticks to the core low-risk advice.
Right, and I'm coming at it from, well, a slightly different angle. I believe the guide presents a pretty fundamental internal conflict. While it describes, a theoretically safe path, the tools and concepts it says are required for, let's say, secure and profitable participation fundamentally clash with that initial promise of no experience needed. I mean, for anyone actually chasing meaningful returns, the complexity is just far higher than what's advertised.
Okay, well, my position is that the guide succeeds precisely because it anchors the concept in terms people might already understand. It frames yield farming as sort of analogous to a high-interest savings account, but, in the crypto world. The emphasis is squarely on its passive nature. You are simply lending or staking your digital assets and earning rewards. That's the core idea. And the guide demonstrates this immediate accessibility through its 5-step, super simple process. Buy crypto, connect your wallet, go to the platform, deposit, and then earn rewards. I mean, that is a functional, actionable roadmap. Crucially, the material responsibly points the beginner towards established, time-tested platforms like Aave and Compound. It explicitly labels them as low risk and recommends stablecoins like USDC or USDT as the main assets. Earning a reliable, say 3 to 10% per year this way is a safe, validated entry point. And furthermore, the fact that they include a clear risk mitigation section, addressing things like price drops, smart contract bugs, and scams, and offering actionable solutions like stick to big platforms, that really validates the claim that a novice can approach this space with some confidence.
That's an interesting point, though I'd frame it quite differently. Look, the guide is basically selling simplicity. But it necessitates complexity if the user wants to do anything more than just a minimal, almost educational deposit. Yes, okay, the 5-step process for putting $100 into Aave for maybe 5 to 7% is, mechanically speaking, simple. I'll give you that. But we have to look at what else the guide promotes right alongside it. You've got platforms like Beefy Finance offering, frankly, exponential rewards, 15% to over 100% plus. Now, those high yields are the undeniable primary lure here, yet they inherently carry a medium-high risk level and, let's be honest, require understanding pretty complex underlying mechanics, like auto-compounding, just to work efficiently. So I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that no experience needed assertion. The guide immediately undercuts itself by requiring users to master tools that are necessary for security, not just for depositing funds. Things like MetaMask, CoinGecko, using Etherscan for tracking gas fees, and crucially, a vetting site like DeFiSafety.com. A genuine beginner doesn't know what a volatile gas fee even is, let alone how to monitor it using a block explorer like Etherscan, or, frankly, how to interpret and audit safety score from DeFiSafety. The risks, yeah, they're acknowledged, but they feel severely oversimplified. Using stablecoins, okay, that prevents market volatility on your principal. But it offers exactly zero mitigation against smart contract failure, which is the exact primary risk you face on these newer, high-yield farms that beginners are, let's face it, psychologically steered towards.
Okay, let's address that conflict by maybe drilling down on the definition of simplicity. I see why you characterize the necessary tools as complexity, But let me offer maybe a different perspective on that infrastructure. The core activity, the actual act of yielding, is simple: deposit and earn. The 5-step action plan proves that the barrier to executing the action itself is incredibly low. The tools you mentioned, MetaMask, CoinGecko, well, they're becoming standard digital requirements for interacting with any decentralized application, whether it's DeFi or something else. They are, you could say, the foundational infrastructure. They aren't some kind of advanced technical expertise required solely for complex yield farming strategy. Learning how to manage a basic crypto wallet and check prices online is, rapidly becoming just foundational digital literacy. I mean, if we'd expect people to understand how to use multi-factor authentication for their online bank or navigate an app store, then learning how to use a web extension wallet like MetaMask is, I'd argue, a comparable and necessary first step.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because you seem to be equating basic operational use with the necessary level of, let's call it, responsible technical oversight. Sending 100 USDC to MetaMask is simple. Okay, I grant you that. But to participate responsibly and securely, especially when you're managing things like gas fees and potentially multiple chains, the user really has to become something of an operational expert. Let's just focus on Etherscan for a second. You need Etherscan because the gas fees, those transaction costs on networks like Ethereum, are entirely opaque and incredibly volatile. They can swing wildly from minute to minute. Now, for a beginner depositing a relatively small amount, say $500, a sudden spike in gas fees from, $5 to $50 can completely wipe out months of expected 5% returns.
Using Etherscan isn't just digital literacy. It's specialized external monitoring required because the underlying infrastructure is, frankly, fundamentally hostile to small, uninformed users. And furthermore, they have to differentiate between fundamentally different network chains, ETH, BNB, Polygon, which all have distinct security profiles and cost structures. These aren't minor technical differences. They are absolutely central to managing risk.
Right, I agree that gas fees require diligence, but the guide actually counters this complexity by steering users away from those high-cost chains. They explicitly recommend cheaper chains like BNB or Polygon Matic. This helps mitigate the risk of gas fees eating up small returns, making constant Etherscan monitoring perhaps less critical for initial success. But setting aside the tool argument for a moment, let's look at the core conflict you raised, the alignment of risk and reward. The guide, I believe, offers pretty clear risk stratification. Beginners are explicitly advised, both in a pro tip and just through the structure of the risk table itself, to start with Aave or Compound, using stablecoins. This is the low-risk pathway, presented first and foremost. This strategy minimizes the downside exposure while allowing the beginner to successfully, test the mechanics. And the golden rule they mention, only farm with money you can afford to lose, that serves as the ultimate safety net and really a necessary warning for any kind of financial activity, whether it's traditional stocks or crypto. The guide isn't forcing high risk, it's presenting options, but with transparent warnings attached.
That's a compelling argument if you just look at the textual warnings, okay? But have you considered the promotional structure and just the basic psychology of the user here? The real problem is the incredibly seductive nature of those advertised high yields, 15% to 100% plus, which are prominently listed right there in the exact same beginner-friendly table as the low-risk options like Aave. That creates serious cognitive dissonance. The human mind is, let's be honest, naturally drawn to the promise of turning $100 into $200 in a year, right? It's a fantasy that severely outweighs the modest, realistic 5-7% offered by Aave. So why even include platforms like Beefy Finance, medium high risk 100% plus, and PancakeSwap, medium risk 50% plus, in a guide that's explicitly aimed at people who are told no experience needed? It feels like the guide functions more as a promotional funnel. It validates the beginner's natural inclination to chase the maximum yield. So a beginner, having successfully navigated the quote-unquote simple 5 steps on Aave, is then immediately incentivized to jump over to a higher risk farm, looking for a bigger return, probably assuming that the process, having been framed as simple once, just remains simple. They're effectively being steered towards complexity and risk that directly contradicts the initial premise of simplicity. And let's be clear, achieving those high returns requires mastering exactly the complex, high-risk strategies, like dealing with exotic farming tokens and multi-chain auto-compounders that the guide sort of implies are unnecessary for the beginner.
I think maybe you're projecting a bit too much malice onto the presentation. It's intended as a comprehensive guide, right? And a comprehensive guide has to present the full landscape of options, not just the absolute safest one. I mean, to omit the existence of high-yield farms entirely would be misleading in its own way. The distinction is clearly drawn between the rewards offered by staking stablecoins on Aave, which is true low-risk passive income, versus the rewards offered by the riskier platforms. The guide clearly stratifies the risk of each platform, low, medium, or high. I think that's sufficient disclosure. The user, having been explicitly warned about the increased risk and armed with that golden rule, is then making a calculated, informed choice if they decide to proceed to riskier options.
But the problem isn't just the disclosure of the risk label low, medium, high. The problem is the inadequate disclosure of the mechanisms that actually create that risk. Let's look specifically at the rewards from those high-yield farms. Often, they reward users not just with the underlying coin they deposited, but with a separate farming token, like Cake from PancakeSwap or Comp from Compound. Now, this token itself is often subject to massive price volatility and dilution. So the beginner thinks they're earning, say, 100% APR, but that 100% is being paid out in a token that might drop 50% in value next week. Using stablecoins protects the initial deposit, sure, but the reward structure itself introduces this massive new layer of volatility risk that just isn't adequately explained in that simple risk section.
Okay, let's look specifically at the risk mitigation advice then, because I still maintain that for the recommended low-risk entry point, the advice is targeted and practical. Using stablecoins immediately addresses market volatility risk on the principal deposit. Sticking to big, established platforms like Aave or Compound fundamentally reduces smart contract risk. These are time-tested, they're heavily audited, they hold enormous amounts of liquidity. And, as I mentioned before, recommending cheap chains like BNB or Matic directly addresses the very real issue of high transaction costs. This targeted advice is precisely what a beginner needs to, dip their toe in the water safely and gain some practical experience before deciding if they want to move up the risk ladder.
But the sufficiency of that advice just completely collapses the moment the user starts chasing those 100% plus returns, which, again, the guide implicitly incentivizes them to do. Avoiding smart contract bugs by simply saying stick to big platforms is, it's a helpful suggestion, but it's really an assumption, isn't it? It's not a comprehensive strategy for the whole universe of platforms listed in their table. And what happens when the beginner, having successfully done the simple steps on Aave, moves to a high-yield platform like, say, PancakeSwap, which often involves providing liquidity? They immediately encounter something called impermanent loss. Now, this risk is completely fundamental to many, many high-yield strategies, yet it is not even mentioned anywhere in the risk section of this beginner's guide.
Right, that's a fair point. Could you maybe quickly define impermanent loss just for the benefit of the audience, as it's a pretty critical technical concept in this space?
Absolutely. In simple terms, when you provide liquidity, which means pairing two different crypto coins together in a pool so others can trade them, impermanent loss is basically the temporary difference in value you experience compared to if you had just held those two coins separately in your wallet. It's sort of like watching two stocks you own drop, but maybe at different speeds. So your combined value isn't what you expect. The loss only becomes permanent if you actually withdraw your assets from the pool while they're down compared to holding. This risk is absolutely central to liquidity provision, which is required for many of the high-yield farms the guide mentions. So, to completely omit this core risk, or at least fail to explain it, when you're promoting platforms where it's practically inescapable, well, that demonstrates a massive gap in user safety education. It feels like the guide prioritizes promotional momentum over genuinely comprehensive safety.
Okay. I can concede that impermanent loss is a highly complex risk, and yes, it would certainly benefit from a more detailed explanation in a beginner's guide. However, I'd argue the guide's primary goal here is introducing the concept of yield farming and providing that safe on-ramp. I still maintain that for the absolute beginner, the core advice, use stablecoins, stick to major platforms, is sufficient to begin earning some passive income securely.
So in that sense, the guide serves its purpose by validating the initial premise of simplicity for getting started.
See, I think the guide validates the simplicity of the action, the clicking of buttons, but it fails to validate the simplicity of the outcome, especially the safe outcome when pursuing high yields. The complexity required for genuine safety monitoring chains, assessing farming token volatility, understanding smart contract risk beyond just big platform good, it all makes the endeavor far more demanding than just no experience needed. If the target audience truly is beginners, then the material has to be judged on how safely and simply it allows them to pursue the most attractive options it presents, and on that front, I think it fails that test.
Ultimately, I think we both agree that the material does successfully illuminate the core mechanics of yield farming, and it demonstrates that, yes, a pathway to passive income does exist in DeFi.
Absolutely, yes. But we disagree pretty profoundly on whether its framing appropriately manages that inherent tension between the low-risk, low-reward path and the, let's call it, gravitational pull of high reward for the target audience. The low-risk path is simple but perhaps unappealingly modest. The high-yield path is very attractive but deceptively complex and risky.
Right. The material effectively forces the reader to confront that fundamental trade-off. Simplicity and safety tend to come with modest, single-digit returns, while chasing high yield inevitably demands greater complexity, more technical mastery, and certainly a higher tolerance for risk.
And the material, unfortunately, in my view, makes that complex high-risk choice look far too simple, suggesting perhaps that minimal technical effort can somehow lead to maximal financial gain, which is rarely the case.